Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. You know, I thought with Easter week and that sort of thing that we might have a low turnout. You'd think after 12 years, I'd learned my lesson. This community turns out for the best. I'm Joe Shepard. I'm president of Western New Mexico University, and we have just a delightful evening scheduled for you tonight of a renowned author. But before I introduce him, I have to introduce the spy that loves me. And that's my wife, Valerie Plame. And I always tease Valerie because many of you know of her story. Worked for the CIA, was outed in 2003 by the Bush administration, went on a movie called Fair Game, was made about that whole thing because her then husband, also by the same name, Valerie has a hard time marrying somebody other than a guy named Joe. She tried to change my name just like she did our dog, but that's another story. But her then husband, Joe Wilson, of course, as many of you know, New York Times, wrote about the war in Iraq and what he did not find in Africa, led to the Bush administration taking it out ultimately on Valerie. And of course, back in 2003, prior to this, when she was serving in the CIA, she started off part of her career in Greece. And she tells me the story that when she was in Greece, she said, you know, someday I'm going to move to Silver City, New Mexico. So she's completed her dream there, and we're quite happy with that. But the real treasure here tonight is Michael McGarrity. Michael has written over 18 books, with his most recent one, The Long Ago, that's coming out here in July. A little bit about Michael. I've gotten to know him only over the last few days. They're worried that I might mess up his bio. We'll see how I do. But he was in law enforcement for a while, deputy sheriff over in Santa Fe. Some of you may know of that piece. And in fact, Kevin Kearney, his protagonist in his series, and of course the trilogy that talks about the Kearney family, law enforcement was his protagonist's livelihood. And you see that show up in a lot of his books and his novels. But what you may not know about Michael is not only was he in law enforcement, and not only did he get Sheriff of the Year, he also was in social work for a while, and he became Social Worker of the Year in 1980. Now, if we take a look at his journey, we see a little spattering of things. Once upon a time, he was in the Army, ended up at White Sands. That brings him to New Mexico. Ends up, of course, when he left there, he was 3 years at University of New Mexico. And then he went to San Jose State to finish up his degree. That was his bachelor's degree. His master's in social work came from the University of Iowa. So he has a master's in clinical social work. So he has that background that many of us don't know. But as you read about him, he gets the Governor's Award in terms of the arts for his writing, Social Worker of the Year, Sheriff, and tonight, of course, his greatest honor, Distinguished Speaker here at Western New Mexico University. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have about 45 minutes of Valerie and Michael having a conversation and asking questions. And then afterwards, we'll have about 15 minutes of your opportunity. And then after that, if you want to stick around and tell him how wonderful he is, he'd appreciate that because it's been a hard day for him. So if you could do that for me, I'd appreciate that. With that, let's give Michael McGarrity and Valerie Plame a warm Silver City welcome.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Joe Shepard, and thank you all for coming out this evening. It's really such a pleasure. Michael and his wife, Mimi, who could not be here because she's under the weather, were some of my first friends when I moved from Washington, D.C. to Santa Fe in 2007. We reached out to him because we were so enthusiastic about moving to our new home in New Mexico. And Michael's novels, of course, are based here and saturated in New Mexico. So we've remained friends all these many years, and when I asked him to come, he didn't hesitate. And what a pleasure to have you here.
It's great to be with you again.
When I asked him, like, you know, how do you want this evening to go? What do you want to do? honestly, much to my relief, he's like, do we have to talk all about my books? We will get to that, and we will. But what he proposed, and the first part of our conversation, and that's what we want it to be, will be on the novel and how it evolved, and how, because this is his livelihood. I did 2 spy thrillers, a piece of that novel, but how they came to be. So, and we'll talk about how they evolved and the impact on society. So starting with that, over to you, Michael, and talking about, we can start off with the book that you told me to read.
Right, Voltaire's Bastards. It's a book about how rational thinking has kind of been co-opted by the establishment. And to me, it's a very thought-provoking book. There's a chapter in it that I asked Valerie to read. It's called The Faithful Witness. And guess what that chapter's about? It's about the novel and people who write novels. Isn't that a great title for a chapter, The Faithful Witness? One of the things I wanted to avoid is talking about myself as a writer or talking about my work, because I think there's a broader subject here. And let me throw this out as an idea. And it's not new to me. The novel is a unique experience between the artist and the recipient of the work, because it's about the only art form, if you want to call it an art form, where 2 things happen. First of all, if the writer has done their job well, he disappears from the story. You won't find him or her raising their head up to pontificate or soapbox or tell you what you should think or tell you what you should believe. So let's start with that premise. The invisible artist is the novelist who vanishes because the story is what's important to tell. The second point is the reader fully participates. In order for it to work, in order for the novel to work, there has got to be some element to the story that is so believable that you can transpose yourself right into it, that you can see yourself in the story. You can see yourself in the place. You can see yourself in the situation. And that is, to me, totally unique.
May I interject here to say that he talks about this in the chapter. This is why so many books do not fare well when they make the transition to the screen, right? It's in your head already. You're there, you taste it, you smell it, you feel it. And then someone else comes along with their imagination, and it's like, no, that doesn't match up at all.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to say about novels, that is also part of what John Ralston Saul says in his book, is if you look at the evolution of the modern novel, it came out of, we're not talking about Plato, we're not talking about Chaucer, we're talking about 1800s. It came out of an adventuresome spirit of the human nature. There were scientists, there were botanists, there were physicians, there were soldiers of fortune, there were these people who went out and had these experiences that informed them to the point that they had to write about something, whether it was poverty, whether it was a genteel society, whether it was war, whether it was some exotic foreign place that most people had never been to. And that was the impetus for what gave birth to the modern novel. And it came at a time when technology was ripe.
Right, there are a couple things, as he points out in the book, but were obvious when you actually think about it. Certain conditions had to be in place to allow the novel, as we think of it, to come into being. First, it had to be written in the vernacular. It was no longer, of course, most people were illiterate. The vast majority of societies in Western Europe were illiterate. And the language that was in use was ecclesiastical Latin, or something that they couldn't quite follow. So one, the populace had to be more literate. Two, the books had to be written in a vernacular. It's actually written in English, or it's written in German. That's why Shakespeare made such a sensation. He's telling stories in language that they really understood. Of course, with the printing press and the actual distribution of books that could be reproduced, then all of a sudden it lays the table to allow people to write about these things that it's either to entertain or to change society, but the whole point was to reach you, the reader, with that silent witness, faithful witness.
It's a very important piece of history in the evolution of storytelling. One of the things that happens a little later on, which is kind of interesting, is academics get involved. And what they really basically do is they hijack the novel. And what they decide is that the writer is more interesting than the story. And so they start having these vast discussions based a lot on Freudian psychoanalysis about the dysfunctional life of the artist, about Scott Fitzgerald's terrible manners and behavior, Hemingway's suicidal tendencies. It goes on and on and on. And it's now almost pro forma that the writer, while he or she may be invisible in terms of the story that you read, is now a celebrity. And you know something? There's no reason for that. There's absolutely no reason for that. It's a matter of branding. Now we brand everything, right? I'll give you an example. Lee Childs writes mystery novels. He's decided he's not going to write mystery novels anymore. He'll have his brother write them. And that's what's going on. It keeps the brand going, and this is what the publishing houses want.
And James Patterson, doesn't he basically have a factory?
He's got a factory, yeah.
Yeah.
He's got a factory going.
Tom Clancy, long dead,
Yeah.
still their Tom Clancy
Right.
novels. Yeah.
So there's this commercialization that happens, and that's continuing, that really erodes the breadth of storytelling that should be out there and should be available. And so it's curtailed. It's curtailed because what all publishers want is they want to profit. They want to sell large amounts of books. And that becomes actually the writer's job. The publishing house wants Valerie to go out and promote her books. They want me to go out and promote my books. They want to spend the least amount of money possible to see that happen. So if you're somebody like, I don't know, a U.S. senator who wants to write a memoir, and if you're a name person, you're going to get probably a 7-figure advance to do that because you've got the name recognition.
You got to sell a lot of books to make up that
And it's going to sell a lot of
advance.
books. So to me, the issue that we face today is the commercialization of fiction, the reliance on the cult of personality to continue to fuel the engine of publishing, and then the emergence of new voices that are basically the product of creative writing programs. And I don't know whether that's a good or a bad thing.
Well, it's changed. I know, so my memoir, Fair Game, came out in 2007. And I had an inkling, but I didn't quite appreciate at the time. That really was the beginning of the whole publishing industry completely transforming in different ways. There was a lot of consolidation, corporate takeovers, book tours that I've had, that you've had, where your publisher pays for you to go from city to city, and you go to the Poison Pen, and you go to Politics and Prose in Washington, and so forth. They're almost a thing of the past, except in very rare cases. And of course, Amazon has created a huge distortion as well. You could have a whole other conversation on how the industry has changed. But to your point, Michael, the voice, the voices, do we still have the diversity of voices? What gets pushed to us? As you know, if you go by an airport bookstore, the outward-facing jackets as you go by to catch your flight, they're all sort of the same thing. You could go by the same bookstore 1 year later, and it's like exactly the same.
And what you wind up having is writers doing events for each other and for their base, if you will, right? And so when you go to do a book signing, since I'm in the category, and I really have a problem with category, when I'm in the genre of being a mystery writer, that's who's going to come to a signing.
Yeah, it's very...
And when you go to a conference, well, they have even these specialty conferences just for mystery writers, just for romance writers, just for
Thrillers,
science fiction writers.
everything.
And it goes on and on and on. It's like, it's like preaching to the choir. And it truncates everything to me. It just collapses everything, and instead of having this broad spectrum that we can choose from, everything gets compartmentalized.
But isn't that following, say, what we watch on TV? Everything is hot, they're targeting a precise demographic. We can all talk. I'm not saying this is good or bad, it's just different, right? It used to be 3 network stations and you're gonna like them, right? You're gonna like what you're given. And now with the advent of cable, not to mention streaming, everything is so highly curated, just for you, because we know this is what you like and you're gonna see more of this. Same has happened in the publishing world.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I wanna mention is that experience is important. I used to say that there was nothing autobiographical in my writing, and I was deluding myself, because everything I write is based on this vessel of 80-some years of experience that led me to a point where I felt I could try to tell stories. And so I can't deny my own personal history. One of the things that I love to say when I do a talk is by a writer by the name of John Donne, who famously quoted as saying, "Every writer should thank their lucky stars they came from a dysfunctional family." And I did. And I do thank my stars for that, because if you look at my body of work, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do, my 18th novel will be out on the 4th of July. It's The Long Ago.
Which I happen to have.
She has the advanced
copy.
reader's copy of it. It's not part of my crime series. It's certainly not part of the historical trilogy. And it's a real spin-off, and it's not even set in New Mexico. So I ended the Kevin Kearney series voluntarily. I wanted to end it, because to me, writing is a creative challenge, and I wanted to see how far I could reach. And I wrote The Long Ago, and what is it? Well, it's a spin-off. Okay, so I've done a crime series, I've done a prequel trilogy, and now I've done a spin-off. And what's the spin-off? Well, it's about my protagonist's wife's family. Completely different. Where is it set? Montana, Northern California, Southern California, Vietnam. And it's set in the early 1960s, which is my era. And I think a few people in the audience also shares that era. So I would not be able to have written this book if I didn't know what, for example, Sierra Madre Canyon in Southern California looked like in the early 1960s or in the mid-1960s. So I draw a lot on my personal experience. I mean, it really formed the basis of Tularosa, my debut novel, which came out
Yeah, what year was that?
27 years ago. 96 it came out. Well, people would ask me, how come you know so much about White Sands Missile Range? And the answer was very simple. I was stationed there. I got to see things that most people will never see at White Sands Missile Range. So you draw from experience, but you've got to have experience. One of the things we were talking about last night, I got on a roll with this one. There are writers out there that use words beautifully. They are eloquent. They are flowering. They are just major. You suck it up. It's just, wow, you wrote that? And it doesn't do any good because it doesn't go anywhere. You know, it's just beautiful writing. Beautiful writing without a story to go with it and without what you can draw on to be able to inform it well enough to make it so real that you fall into it as a reader is a completely different act.
Could you speak a little bit about the research that goes into your
Sure.
your work?
Well, one of the things I like to say is that you've got to know your setting. You've got to know the locale. If you're writing about Brooklyn, New York, you don't want to sound like a New Mexican. Okay? You don't want to walk like a New Mexican, talk like, you don't even want to have a meal like a New Mexican, right? So who you are as a human being has to be real enough so that you can imagine what it's like for someone to live in a certain place. Not only how they live, how they walk, how they talk, how they interact, it's all based, it's in our chromosomes. Mm-hmm. It's what raises us up and turns us into who we are as human beings. So there's that element, there's the human element of the person in the setting, and then it's the setting itself. How does the land look? What lives on the land? What can you see at different times of day? What can you see at different times of year? What's the sun like? What's the angle of the sun? All of those things you have to go out and act, and I love it. It's the best part of the writing process.
But you had a job long before you were a novelist that allowed you to travel all over this enormous state, which is so varied in its geography, that must have helped. Like you know what reserve looks like.
It was like before I really picked up the pen and started writing. By the way, I wrote 2 really bad manuscripts that have disappeared from the face of the earth because I didn't know what I was doing. I just knew I wanted to try. But I would get out there and there would be these images that would go floating through my head of things that I'd see. And some of it would be historical. I'd say, my God, I could see the conquistadors going through that pass right now. Or something like that would happen. Or I could visualize the trail where it's now a highway. I don't know if you know this or not, but a lot of our roads in this state started out as Indian trails, as Native American trails. And now they're roads that we drive on our highway, and we don't even know that we're driving along an ancient route that was there long before there was the automobile, long before there was the wagon. So all of that was, 25 years, 50 years, well, I don't know, 65 years in this state has given me, I think, a reservoir of understanding and hopefully knowledge that I can put to use when I write. Mm-hmm. And that to me is one of the most valuable things about the writing experience is doing all of that work first before I ever sit down. I was telling Valerie last night, I need about 3 or 4 things to start a book. And
this is great advice.
And I'm gonna give you an example I keep a list of titles. I have a list of 7 or 8 titles, working titles that I may or may never use, right? But there they are. And my latest one is, I have to remember it now.
the dreadful one?
Yeah, Dreadful Sorry. The working title is Dreadful Sorry. And it opens with a woman having killed her abusive husband and gives birth to her infant son, knowing that she will never live long enough to see him raised, and names him Dreadful Sorry. Not because she killed her husband, but because she couldn't raise her son. And, you know, think about that. Can you all sort of imagine where that might go? Just real quick, where it might go? I mean, first of all, it's a dynamite opening. Would you agree? What a way to open a book. And what a title. I mean, wouldn't you look at a book cover in a bookstore and see Dreadful Sorry? I've got to at least read the jacket copy. You know, what's this guy writing about? So, you know, if you have a working title like that, and you have a way to kick off the story like that, and you have an idea of where you'd like to go, even though it may change radically by the time you get to the end, you're on the way.
Yeah.
You're already on the way with something brilliant. So I would never try to write a novel without knowing what I wanted to call it. It's like, how can you have a dog and not have, you know, it's like, dog? No, you can't do that. If you have a dog, you have to give it a name, you know. So anyway, that's are there any amateur or professional writers in the audience? Anybody out there? So, one or two. That's my advice to you. Dreadful Sorry.
But can you share a couple other pieces of advice that you shared with us last night about, besides start with a title, which really sort of drives you forward. What else is like your golden rule?
I don't know if I have any real golden rules. You know, you've got, it's the research, that's an element of it. You've got to write something that's real. Well, I'll give you an example. I'm an avid subscriber to the New Yorker magazine. And first of all, their cartoons have gotten really bad. You know, they're just not funny anymore. Their fiction is okay. It's an emerging voice, but I'm reading a short story, and it's by a Korean writer, and the Korean writer is writing about something that happens in the army, and he's got a staff sergeant and a corporal and all these other people, and by God, he doesn't know a damn thing about the military. And it just glares at you. You know, it's just like, that can't be. That just is not the way it is. Now, he might be trying to tell you a good story, but if he pulls me out of the story, he's probably going to pull you out of the story too. So there has to be authenticity.
Yeah.
In that way, and sometimes that's lacking. The other thing is this whole issue of internal states. That there are a lot of young writers out there whose basic experience is their inner state, is their young life. And so they're going to be writing psychodrama fiction that probably doesn't appeal to very many people at all, other than maybe the members of their writing group.
Yeah.
You know? But that seems to be a real trend in fiction today. I want to say one more thing about my body of work, if I can. You can call it crime fiction. You can call it historical fiction. You can say I'm doing a spin-off. But you've heard a little bit about my background from Dr. Shepard in terms of what I've done with my life as an adult. All my books, basically, are about family. They're all about family. Mm. And, okay, you can pigeonhole me. You can say you write crime procedurals and mystery fiction. You've written historical fiction. Now you're doing a spin-off. But that's not what I've been writing about for the last 27 years. I've been writing about family. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm going to continue to write about, except for my next book after this one. All right?
I've got a question for you.
Okay.
Over the breadth of your now 18 published novels, I think one of the things that makes New Mexico unique are the three dominant cultures, Hispanic, Anglo, Indigenous. And it seems to me, I haven't read all 18, but you do dive into each of those.
How do I get away with that?
Yeah, and how do you decide how to braid that together?
Well, I don't know whether I braid it together. I will answer your question this way and say, when it comes to cultures that I'm not part of, I deal with it very judiciously, very carefully. I have a Mescalero Apache in the series, and I have to tell you, I have fans in Mescalero that appreciate the way I have researched that culture in terms of placing it in this character domain. So that's one thing, and you've got to know what not to do and what not to say, and not where to go where you have no business going. Last night I mentioned I got a really nice email from a lady from Tularosa, Hispanic lady. And she wrote me, and it gave me chills when I read the email. She said, I and my siblings have read your trilogy 3 times. And every time I read it, it's a story of my family. Now, you can't get praise better than that.
No.
You cannot get praise better than that. I didn't start out to do that, but crafting believable characters is no easy matter. It's a difficult thing, and they have to come alive on the page. They have to be so alive that they'll tell you when they want to come back. I'm serious.
Yeah.
You know, I have voices in my head. Does that make me schizophrenic? No. It makes me a writer who has characters that flow through his head. And then occasionally I've had to kill one or two, just because I was tired of them. Get out of here.
But I'm going to be all fangirl for you. I reach for nonfiction. I go for memoirs or politics or history. And when the first Hard Country, that's the first one of the trilogy, came out, Michael's my friend. Yeah, okay, I'll read your book, you know. And I loved it. And that is, I read all of them, and you know it's good when you're sorry that it ends, right? Sorry to put it down. You become, as you say, invested in these characters. And when someone has to die, it's...
One of the hardest things in that trilogy for me was to have a character that was in all 3 books that was absolutely unlikable. This was a guy, nobody could like this guy. That is so hard to do.
But he kind of mellowed in his
Yes,
old age.
yes. There was some redemption in the final,
Yes.
book of the trilogy, but having this antagonistic, difficult, angry man play such a pivotal role in the story of this generational story that covers 100 years of history was no easy matter. And there were people, other writers, who were saying, "Oh no, you'll lose the audience, you'll lose the reader.
Not at all.
You don't have to
Not
lose.
at
No."
all.
So that was hard work. And I used to say to myself, "Am I going to live long enough to finish this?" Because it kept blowing up, you know.
I highly recommend it to all of you. Did you want to do like the...
Yeah, here's a little trick. Here's a little
party trick we wanted to do?
Here's a little trick. When you go to a reading, usually the author gets to pick what he or she wants to read, right? And they've got a favorite spot that they want to read. Maybe it's the beginning of the story. Maybe it's some scene that has a climax to it that just is breathtakingly wonderful, or something that's written so eloquently they can't avoid not sharing it with you. And here's what I think. If I do my job right, somebody in the audience would be able to pick a page, not from the beginning and not from the end, pick a page from this book and I will read it. And if I've done my job right, I will do one of several things. I will either, or maybe all of these things. I will have informed you of something, I've entertained you, or I've somehow even reached you in a way that it was surprising and unprepared for. So you want to try that? You want to do that?
Yeah. So, Chala, come up.
Come up and just pick the page.
Pick a page, any page.
Pick a page.
Should I close my eyes?
No.
Just not the very beginning, not the very end.
And I'm not going to tell you anything about the plot at all. What page did she pick?
Well, she can choose either.
Okay.
Thank you, John.
They drove to the neighboring town of Palmdale and showed Barbara's photograph around at some businesses without success. They canvassed folks in the village of Pearl Blossom with no luck before returning to the Lancaster Sheriff substation, which was opened as promised. An amiable young deputy greeted them at the door, shook his head at Barbara's photograph, and said he'd never seen her. Ray told him Detective Dunwoody might have interviewed her when she had worked at the area ranch. Both mentioned that they knew the detective was on vacation, but it would mean a lot if they could speak to him. She politely asked the deputy to call and see if Dunwoody would be willing to spare a moment. The deputy hesitated momentarily, nodded okay, and made the call. After a brief conversation, he hung up and told them to wait outside in their vehicle. Detective Dunwoody would arrive shortly. 10 minutes later, a red International Harvester pickup truck pulled next to Ray's Ford. The driver, a man thick through the chest with curly graying hair, wearing grubby blue jeans, work boots, and a sweat-stained Western shirt, approached Ray at the driver's side door. "I'm Detective Dunwoody. You wanted to speak to me?" Ray stepped out of the car, thanked the detective for coming, introduced himself, and handed him Barbara's photograph with a shaky hand. You may have spoken to him," he said. "I did, as part of a follow-up to a fatal car crash. Pretty girl. She looked familiar at the time, but I didn't know she was a missing person. You listed her last name as Crawford in your report. Did you ask if she was married?" "I had no reason to, but I recall she wore a wedding ring." "How did she seem to you?" Ray asked. "A little shook up by what happened, but otherwise okay. I'd say she was happy. Looked that way to me." "Do you know where she went?" "No, I only spoke to her that once. Since 12 Tree changed hands, most of the folks who work there have scattered. Your best bet, who might know, is Carlos Luna de la Cruz." According to Dunwoody, after he had been forced off the ranch by the new owner, Carlos's health had deteriorated. He now rented a room from a Mexican woman who looked after him. He wrote down her name and address on the back of a piece of junk mail and gave it to Ray. "It's outside the town limits in a little Mexican barrio. Look for the closed-down, tumbled-down gas station and turn right. It won't be hard to find." "Thanks," Ray said. "Good luck finding your sister." Ray sat behind the wheel for a long minute, simultaneously grinning and shaking his head in amazement. "She's okay. Barbara's okay. I'm so goddamn happy." "It's wonderful," Beth said, clutching his hand. "I've dreaded the thought that she was dead." "Me too. I've got to let John and Netta know. I'll call them tonight." "Yes, you must," Beth said with a sense of relief. "What a good day this has turned out to be." "Amen to that." Still grinning, Ray wheeled the Ford toward the highway.
Good job, Chala.
So did that work? Okay. That's why I do it. And you know what? I don't know anybody else who does that. You know? And I think it's much more fun for me. Well, somebody didn't like me. It's much more fun for me to do that than it is to read a prepared section. And I hope it was fun for you.
Yeah. Well, this is a good moment then to turn it over to you for some questions from the audience. Oh, and President Shepard will be the
Vanna White.
Vanna White of the evening.
Thank you. Michael, knowing that you write from your experiences, can one do that awful thing called assume, and you know what that does, right?
Can one assume what?
That your characters are based also on people in your world.
This is another important point because, in a way, the answer is yes. It seems to me one of the things that a good novelist must be is an excellent observer. And one of the things I love about our society is people talk about things that I would never bring up in public. And they do it all the time. They do it at parties. They do it in restaurants. They do it when you're sitting there and you're listening while you're eating your dinner, you know. And so the act of observing what people do and what they have to say and how they reveal themselves and what they reveal is all part of what a good fiction writer has to be about. I mean, you have to be a student of human nature. You have to watch people. And yes, there are times that I have borrowed some people that I knew personally and transformed them into fictional characters. There was one guy that I worked with that I couldn't stand. And he had, this was my working with the Community Mental Health Center in Santa Fe. We, at one point in this society, had community mental health centers, right? We no longer have those anymore. We don't need them. We need to give everybody an AR-15. But he was this little guy, and he was kind of like a Napoleon tyrant type of person. But he had this vein in his head. Whenever he got upset, it would always throb, right? And I had to use that in a character, you know? And he wasn't a pleasant character either. So, yes, of course.
Who would like to go next to be the next character in his book? Okay, over here. Depends on your question.
I just wanted to ask what you think about the self-publishing movement. So many people, and I have a few friends that have published themselves.
I know. I don't have a lot of good things to say about it. I have tried to counsel some people that I thought had some talent. And I really, these are people I know, right? And nice people, and writers who really want to get there. And they've approached me for either an endorsement or some form of counseling. And I'll say, don't give up. Don't go that route. Get tough. Learn to love rejection. You know, I did not become an overnight sensation. It took me 14 years from the time I started writing, and I had day jobs, right? Where I would give up money. I would say, I am not going to work 5 days a week. I'm going to work 4 days a week, lose 20% of my income, so I have a little bit more time to write. So some sacrifice, some persistence, some hard skin when it comes to saying, I can take the rejection, especially if the rejection is the kind where I'm learning from it, where I'm getting some good feedback. And so from the time I sat down and wrote my first really bad story to the time I was published, it was 14 years. Okay? So I am not a fan of saying, oh, I'm at a point now where I can just go out. I'll create my own publishing company, right? And that's what they do. And this is the group of people that you find have conferences with themselves. You know, they all get together once a year and have a conference with themselves and talk about how unfair the publishing world is because they haven't gotten a 7-figure advance, and they're the most wonderful writer that ever stepped, you know, into the 21st or 22nd century, whatever century we're in. I'm not sure anymore. We have time. We have 2 more questions here. Great.
Oh, we have more than that.
Do we?
Yeah, in fact, I want you to tell us, when are you inspired? In the morning or afternoon? I'm kidding.
Thank you so much for being here. Have you ever written a nonfiction book?
No, I've written a couple of. I did. There was a magazine in Santa Fe called the Santa Fean, and I did a couple of nonfiction articles, but that was it. And I only did it because the editor just browbeat me into doing it.
Does it still exist, that magazine?
No, it's gone. It's,
okay.
yeah, part of the reason they went under is because they published my work.
Hi, I second that treat of having two such wonderful writers here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
I also have a question about publishing because for most of the history of my life of publishing in the publishing world, it's been the academic press and the more popular press. And before 2007, it started that academic presses decided they needed to start making more money than they had been. And gone was the book, very intellectual and perhaps very interesting, that would appeal to 1,000 people. And they started publishing more popular, wanting bigger sales.
Right.
Good for some authors and a little devastating to the intellectual world. But I'm wondering if you think this has had an influence on popular press now being at times in competition with some of the big university presses, and if this has perhaps led to more self-publishing.
Yeah, I don't know. That to me is something I haven't really put a lot of thought into, but it seems to me that with legitimate presses, it's like bookstores, the more the merrier, right? One of the things I would do if I lived in your city, and I'm serious, I'm going to tell you this is my advice to you, Silver City people, I would demand a way to have a bookstore in this town because it is such an important cultural element to your society, to your people. Not a used bookstore, a real bookstore with somebody who and I told this to the mayor of Alamogordo too. I did a conference there a couple of years ago. I said, you need a bookstore, and you do. You need a bookstore. Every city needs a bookstore that you can go to. And I would really rally behind that idea if I were you. But no, the more legitimate presses, the better. The more bookstores, the better. The more we can get books into the hands of children, books into the hands of families that don't read and spend too many hours in front of the TV. Anything that we can do on that level of community engagement and community involvement, I would applaud heavily on your behalf to do that. You have a wonderful book festival that you put on every other year, I believe, and that has become a signature event in your community that you should be supporting. You should be working with the literacy people that you have in the various different schools and nonprofits to try to improve and enlarge upon that. All sorts of wonderful things can happen as a result of that. I know that there are people in this audience, I'm looking at a couple of them, that have actually driven from Silver down to Las Cruces to be at one of my book signings down there. That's an amazing, amazing thing to do. So get on the stick and get yourself a bookstore.
Thank you. I'll be brief, but sitting here tonight, I keep thinking about an underlying or overriding responsibility that comes when you are putting the written word out on a venue that can approach so many people. Can you speak to that sense of responsibility you have?
Would you rephrase that again?
The responsibility that comes when you are putting out a venue that impacts so many people. Is there an underlying or overriding dynamic of responsibility that comes as you approach your work?
I'm trying to decode your question in a way that I can respond to it.
Do you feel responsible for what you put out and the impact?
Yeah.
Think about that it will have on your
I try to do that in the sense that I will write about certain social issues that I think are important. In a couple of my novels, I question the whole role of SWAT teams, for example, which has become this paramilitary operation that infests just about every police department in the country. And I am not a fan of it. And so I will question social environmental issues. I will question cultural things that are going on. In another book, I brought up the whole issue of privatized prisons, which I think is a huge mistake. So, yeah, I will put things out there, and I will try to do it in a way so I'm not telling you what I believe. I'm just raising the question of is this something of importance to you? In Ralston Saul, he writes, one of the reasons the police procedural and crime novels are so popular to readers is because they are a reflection of concern of what's going on in our society present day, right? So people will reach out to read those kind of books because there's the underlying societal issue that underpins it. Does that get to what you were asking?
We're also we're being Zoomed as well. So you have 14 participants. Let me make that up. You have 1,500 participants online, and we have a question from one of them in the chat.
Okay.
And the question is, if someone has written a book, but absolutely no publication experience, do you suggest the person try to get their book published by a publisher right away, or should this person build some sort of resume of publishing something in magazines or small things thereof?
There's a complex answer to that question. First of all, thank you for asking it. Question back to you is, are you satisfied that this work is polished enough and complete enough that you can go out into the world and see what other people think of it? If the answer to that is yes, then roll the dice. Mm-hmm. Take it out there and see what happens. You know, there's the 1 in the million chance of another To Kill a Mockingbird can be out there and be found. Why not? The other thing I would say is that never trust your family, friends, or lovers to tell you the truth about your writing.
Wise words.
Because they love you, and they want you to be great, and they want you to be a wonderful writer, and that's more important to them than telling you that you suck.
Fair.
So don't believe that. Just go and get some. I've even had people that I thought their work was good enough, and I don't critique people's work as a matter of course. But I've turned them on to really good freelance editors and said, you know, are you willing to spend some money to find out from a pro what their assessment is in terms of your readiness to go out into the world and seek a publisher? Why not? Why not give it a go? So.
Hi, Michael.
Is that you?
Yes. I'm so glad I drove down here from Belen. What a treat.
Before you go any further, let me introduce to you
Oh.
Anna June, who was an early recipient of the Hillerman McGarrity Creative Writing Scholarship at the University of New Mexico.
Thank you.
And is now an assistant professor at the Valencia campus.
Yeah.
So there she is.
Wow.
At UNM, and I am entranced by this campus. I have major campus envy, by the way. I rolled into town just about an hour before this and went, oh, I'm not leaving. This is beautiful.
Come stay.
I know. I heard some mention of creative writing programs, and of course that's hugely important to me,
right,
given that I teach that, and I came from one. And I wonder if you could say more about your thoughts about creative writing programs, because I'm always looking to expand how I teach creative writing. Hopefully I've got some of my students on Zoom, so maybe they'll recognize.
Okay. I think you have to get away from the model of group critique a little bit more, and because everybody wants support, especially if you're a student, you want support. You want some sort of validation, but you've got to have a standard that says, you've got to give me a first good paragraph before I'm willing to see anything else out of you. right? No matter it's narrative nonfiction or fiction, polish something. Bring me your most polished work. And don't give it to Susie or don't give it to Carl to look at. Make it yours alone, make it stand on its own and be authentically something that you created without anybody else's input, and then we can go from there. So putting the responsibility back on the individual, rather than doing the groupthink or the group critique thing, I think would be a real advantage. Or throw it out as an exercise. Walk into the class and say, I want the best first paragraph on any subject you can give me right now, and you've got this session to do it, right? And challenge them. Challenge them in a way that, that makes them uncomfortable. Don't let them get comfortable, yeah? And I would say that in any discipline. I would say that whether you're trying to become a clinical social worker or trying to become a spy. They didn't make it easy on her to become a spy.
No.
So how's that for a start?
There we go.
Oh, we're so glad you're here this evening. Thank you.
We have time for one more question here.
Having read all of your novels thus far, I've always had a sense that you understand Clayton Istey and his family, his fictitious family, but his Apache family and culture and so forth pretty well. I spent 21 years working for the Navajo Nation, various places, and got to know enough about them and other tribes somewhat, that I know there are some similarities. What you wrote always rang true. I'm just wondering what experience you had that allows you to do that.
Personal experience. Personal experience. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there are stories better left untold. I can sit here and hopefully have spent an hour with you and you've enjoyed it and I've enjoyed being with you. But the reality of who I am is I am a very private person by nature. And I think that's a good thing to be as a writer, to be honest. I think being too gregarious can cost you a lot. I know people that have talked out their stories verbally to the point that they've ruined them. You can talk away a good story to the point that you kill it. You can tell too much of yourself to people. And it's better sometimes, to me as a writer, it's better sometimes to hold things close than it is to let them go or to reveal. So I answered your question with one word, personal. And that has a resonance that goes way beyond the norm. I will say one other thing. I don't write sex scenes. For those of you who have read me, I think you know that. I don't write sex scenes. What I'll write about the dynamic sexual tension that is so enticing and wonderful between a man and a woman. Good God, it gives me chills just to say it.
That sounds personal. Anyways, because we have some people on Zoom, one final chat question. This is actually the Valerie Plame. I'll get your name out just right.
Yeah.
This is Valerie Plame. Why did you marry that shepherd guy? Anyways. Just kidding, folks. What a delightful pair up here. Valerie, thank you so much for hosting this. Michael, you're always welcome here in Silver City and at Western New Mexico University. Please come back, but bring your lovely bride with you the next time. She was a little under the weather, otherwise she'd be here with you. And to all of you, this concludes a wonderful evening here on the Distinguished Lecture Series, and Michael will stick around and answer some of those personal questions one-on-one, but not in a group setting.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Glad you're here.
Thank you.